Hi. Although this is labeled Understanding Comparative Proportion, we are also going to talk about proper proportion so that you can distinguish between proper and comparative proportion. So first of all, what does it mean to compare? And according to dictionary.com, when you compare, you examine two or more objects, ideas, people, etc. in order to note their similarities and differences. So the key word here is two or more, because sometimes when people are talking about comparative proportion in their papers, they don't really compare because they only mention one example. So they don't compare one thing to another. So in the chapter this week, we discussed proper proportion and comparative proportion. So in proper proportion, we're comparing, in one example, one part of an object or figure to its other parts. So if we're talking about this giant cyclops here, it seems like his arms and his legs are in proper proportion compared to his torso and his head. Everything seems to be the right size. So that's when we compare part of something to the rest of that something. And then another way to talk about proper proportion is we are talking about an object or a figure in relationship to the other objects and figures in the artwork. So if we compare the size of this cyclops here, he seems disproportionately large as compared to the size of the people and the sheep and the other objects in the painting. Although, truth be told, he is a giant, so maybe his proportions are right. So the first one is we're comparing part of something to the rest of that something. And then the other kind of proper proportion is we're comparing a whole something to everything else in the artwork. So comparative proportion, we are not comparing things like objects and figures. We're comparing two or more basic formal elements in these terms, in terms of size, quantity, saturated hues versus desaturated colors, relative value, and then other formal elements such as patterns versus solids, or textures versus solids, or the suggestion of time and motion versus stillness, or overlapping versus one-point perspective, etc., things like that. So let's talk about size. If we compare the size of the directional line that is created by the giant's walking stick, and we compare it to the size of the directional line that runs along the under edge of the cave opening, those two directional lines are more or less comparatively the same size. So now we talk about quantity. Quantity relates to how many. So now we're still going to talk in terms of basic formal elements, and we're going to say there are a lot of curve and contour lines in this image. Contour lines on the cyclops's body and loincloth, contour lines that indicate the muscles on the sheep, contour lines in the wrinkles of the men's clothing, etc., etc. There's a lot of contour lines. And also, like, when you give examples of comparative proportion, you mention the basic formal elements that are being compared, but you also give examples where you see these in the image. So there's a lot of curved contour lines, but I can only see one or two straight lines in this, and those are the straight lines on the back of the shelf. So there are comparatively many more contour and curved lines than there are straight lines in this image. So that has to do with quantity, how many as compared to how many of something else. So saturated hues versus desaturated colors. If you recall, saturated hues are only found on the color wheel. Desaturated colors are things that have been mixed with black, with white, with gray, with brown, or have been mixed with their complementary color from the color wheel, which creates a brown. So, for example, The man on the far right is wearing a blue tint scarf. It's not straight up blue hue from the color wheel. It's blue that's been mixed with white. And then the blue has, like where the wrinkles are, they're dark blue shadows, which have been mixed with black. The giant has a light brown loincloth. That's brown mixed with white. The sky is a tint of blue-green. So it's blue-green from the color wheel that's been mixed with white. So there's like browns and dark green. There's desaturated colors everywhere. Remember, white is not a color. There are very few saturated hues. For example, in the cape of Odysseus and in the feathers in his cap, those are a pretty saturated red, although there are areas that have desaturated shadows in them, but we see this really strong red there. And maybe this guy down here has some straight up green from the color wheel, but there are not very many saturated hues in this image. So comparatively, there are many, many more desaturated colors in this than there are saturated hues. So now we talk about relative value, and relative value means like how light or dark or equal in value something is to something else. So we're talking about degrees of lightness and darkness and all those shades in the middle. And by shades, I don't mean like black and white shades or like shades mixed with black. I just mean, and like if you're thinking of a range of white to black and all the light areas in the middle, that's what we're talking about when we're talking about value. So like helps to squint your eye when you're trying to figure out relative value. So if I squint my eye and I look at the Cyclops arm, it's really light. And then comparatively, right next to it, this dark brown rock, that's a really dark value. So comparatively, his arm is much lighter in value than the rock is, which is a dark value. Now let's go to these two guys over here. They're in the shadows. They're actually trying to hide from the Cyclops. And both of them have dark shadows on their clothes. So if we squint our eyes and look at those dark shadows are about equal in value. They're equally as dark. So if I compare the shadows on the two men, comparatively, there's little difference in how dark the values are of the shadows on their clothes. And then finally, this is where you can compare other basic formal elements. So I'm going to do like texture and solids. So the sheep's bodies, they're really textured to indicate their wool. And then when we go to this underside of the cave right here, even though like we know this is made out of rocks, but we can't see that. So this looks like comparatively, it's pretty solid. It's a pretty solid, dark, blackish brown. So comparatively, the sheep's bodies have a lot more texture than this underside of the cave, which appears to be smooth. So now we can go to like suggestion of time and movement, like these vines are blowing in the wind. The Cyclops is like there's a suggestion that he's leaning over and checking the sheep. And then Odysseus here, he is kind of hovering over the sheep in a way to protect his men that are hiding. These guys back here are anxious. They're, you could tell they're like kind of moving around a little bit. Even the sheep, sheep can't stand still, especially if there's a man hidden underneath it. So they're moving a little bit, but the two guys underneath, they're trying to be as quiet and still as they possibly can. So comparatively, there's a lot more movement, suggestion of time and motion in this than there is of stillness. So I hope that helps you gain a much better understanding of proportion in terms of proper proportion and comparative proportion and what makes these two things different. Alrighty, have a great day.